Civilization, Volume 1, Our Oriental Heritage, Part 2, by Will Durant, continued, Cassette 5, Side 1. Meanwhile, despite oppression, bitterness, and poverty, India continued to create science, literature, and art. Professor Jagadish Chandra Bose has won world renown by his researches in electricity and the physiology of plants, and the work of Professor Chandrasekhara Raman in the physics of light has been crowned with the Nobel Prize. In our own century, a new school of painting has arisen in Bengal, which merges the richness of color in the Ajanta frescoes with the delicacy of line in the Rajput miniatures. The paintings of Abanindranath Tagore share modestly in the voluptuous mysticism and the delicate artistry that brought the poetry of his uncle to international fame. The Tagores are one of the great families of history. Devendranath Tagore, Bengali Thakur, was one of the organizers and later the head of the Brahma Samaj. A man of wealth, culture, and sanctity, he became in his old age a heretic patriarch of Bengal. From him have descended the artists Abanindranath and Goganendranath, the philosopher Dwijendranath, and the poet Rabindranath Tagore, the last two being his sons. Rabindranath was brought up in an atmosphere of comfort and refinement in which music, poetry, and high discourse were the very air that he breathed. He was a gentle spirit from birth, a Shelley who refused to die young or to grow old, so affectionate that squirrels climbed upon his knees and birds perched upon his hands. He was observant and receptive, and felt the eddying overtones of experience with a mystic sensitivity. Sometimes he would stand for hours on a balcony, noting with literary instinct the figure and features, the mannerisms and gait of each passer-by in the street. Sometimes, on a sofa in an inner room, he would spend half a day silent with his memories and his dreams. He began to compose verses on a slate, happy in the thought that errors could be so easily wiped away. Soon he was writing songs full of tenderness for India, for the beauty of her scenery, the loveliness of her women, and the sufferings of her people. And he composed the music for these songs himself. All India sang them, and the young poet thrilled to hear them on the lips of rough peasants as he traveled unknown through distant villages. Here is one of them, translated from the Bengali by the author himself. Who else has ever expressed with such sympathetic skepticism the divine nonsense of romantic love? Tell me if this be all true, my lover, tell me if this be true. When these eyes flash their lightning, the dark clouds in your breast make stormy answer. Is it true that my lips are sweet like the opening bud of the first conscious love? Do the memories of vanished months of May linger in my limbs? Does the earth, like a harp, shiver into songs with the touch of my feet? Is it then true that the dewdrops fall from the eyes of night when I am seen, and the morning light is glad when it wraps my body round? Is it true that your love traveled alone through ages and worlds in search of me? That when you found me at last, your age-long desire found utter peace in my gentle speech and my eyes and lips and flowing hair? Is it then true that the mystery of the infinite is written on this little forehead of mine? Tell me, my lover, if all this be true. There are many virtues in these poems, an intense and yet sober patriotism, a femininely subtle understanding of love and woman, nature and man, a passionate penetration into the insight of India's philosophers, and a Tennysonian delicacy of sentiment and phrase. If there is any fault in them, it is that they are too consistently beautiful, too monotonously idealistic and tender. Every woman in them is lovely, and every man in them is infatuated with woman, or death, or God. Nature, though sometimes terrible, is always sublime, never bleak or barren or hideous. Perhaps the story of Chitra is Tagore's story. Her lover, Arjuna, tires of her in a year because she is completely and uninterruptedly beautiful. Only when she loses her beauty and, becoming strong, takes up the natural labors of life, does the god love her again, a profound symbol of the contented marriage. Tagore confesses his limitations with captivating grace. My love, once upon a time your poet launched a great epic in his mind. Alas, I was not careful, and it struck your ringing anklets and came to grief. It broke up into scraps of songs and lay scattered at your feet. Therefore he has sung lyrics to the end, and all the world except the critics has heard him gladly. India was a little surprised when her poet received the Nobel Prize in 1913. The Bengal reviewers had seen only his faults, and the Calcutta professors had used his poems as examples of bad Bengali. The young nationalists disliked him because his condemnation of the abuses in India's moral life was stronger than his cry for political freedom, and when he was knighted, it seemed to them a betrayal of India. He did not hold the honor long, for when by a tragic misunderstanding British soldiers fired into a religious gathering at Amritsar, In 1919, Tagore returned his decorations to the Viceroy with a stinging letter of renunciation. Today he is a solitary figure, perhaps the most impressive of all men now on the earth, a reformer who has had the courage to denounce the most basic of India's institutions, the caste system, and the dearest of her beliefs, transmigration, a nationalist who longs for India's liberty but has dared to protest against the chauvinism and self-seeking that play a part in the nationalist movement, an educator who is tired of oratory and politics and has retreated to his ashram and hermitage at Shantiniketan to teach some of the new generation his gospel of moral self-liberation, a poet broken-hearted by the premature death of his wife and by the humiliation of his country, a philosopher steeped in the Vedanta, a mystic hesitating like Chandidas between woman and God, and yet shorn of the ancestral faith by the extent of his learning, a lover of nature, facing her messengers of death with no other consolation than his unaging gift of song. Ah, poet, the evening draws near, your hair is turning gray. Do you in your lonely musing hear the message of the hereafter? It is evening, said the poet, and I am listening because someone may call from the village, late though it be. I watch if young straying hearts meet together, and two pairs of eager eyes beg for music to break their silence and speak for them. Who is there to weave their passionate songs if I sit on the shore of life and contemplate death and the beyond? It is a trifle that my hair is turning gray. I am ever as young or as old as the youngest and the oldest of this village. They all have need for me, and I have no time to brood over the afterlife. I am of an age with each. What matter if my hair turns gray? 4. East is West. Changing India. Economic changes. Social. The decaying caste system. Castes and guilds. Untouchables. The emergence of woman. That a man unfamiliar with English till almost 50 should write English so well is a sign of the ease with which some of the gaps can be bridged between that East and that West whose mating another poet has banned. For since the birth of Tagore, the West has come to the East in 100 ways, and is changing every aspect of Oriental life. 30,000 miles of railways have webbed the wastes and ghats of India and carried Western faces into every village. Telegraph wires and the printing press have brought to every student the news of a suggestively changing world. English schools have taught British history with a view to make British citizens, and have unwittingly inculcated English ideas of democracy and liberty. Even the East now justifies Heraclitus. Reduced to poverty in the 19th century by the superior machinery of British looms and the higher caliber of British guns, India has now turned her face reluctantly towards industrialization. Handicrafts are dying, factories are growing. At Jamshedpur, the Tata Iron and Steel Company employs 45,000 men and threatens the leadership of American firms in the production of steel. The coal production of India is mounting rapidly. Within a generation, China and India may overtake Europe and America in lifting out of the soil the basic fuels and materials of industry. Not only will these native resources meet native needs, they may compete with the West for the markets of the world, and the conquerors of Asia may suddenly find their markets gone, and the standards of living of their people at home severely reduced by the competition of low-wage labor in once docile and backward, that is, agricultural lands. In Bombay there are factories in mid-Victorian style with old-fashioned wages that bring tears of envy to the eyes of Occidental Tories. Hindu employers have replaced the British in many of these industries and exploit their fellow men with the rapacity of Europeans bearing the white man's burden. The economic basis of Indian society has not changed without affecting social institutions and moral customs of the people. The caste system was conceived in terms of a static and agricultural society. It provided order, but gave no opening to unpedigreed genius, no purchase to ambition and hope, no stimulus to invention and enterprise. It was doomed when the Industrial Revolution reached India's shores. The machine does not respect persons. In most of the factories, men work side by side without discrimination of caste. Trains and trams give berth or standing room to all who can pay. Cooperative societies and political parties bring all grades together, and in the congestion of the urban theater or street, Brahmin and pariah rub elbows in unexpected fellowship. A Raja announces that every caste and creed will find reception at his court. A Shudra becomes the enlightened ruler of Baroda. The Brahma Samaj denounces caste, and the Bengal Provincial Congress of the National Congress advocates the abolition of all caste distinctions forthwith. Slowly the machine lifts a new class to wealth and power and brings the most ancient of living aristocracies to an end. Already the caste terms are losing significance. The word Vaishya is used in books today but has no application in actual life. Even the term Shudra has disappeared from the north, while in the south it is a loose designation for all non-Brahmins. The lower castes of older days have in effect been replaced by over 3,000 castes that are really guilds: bankers, merchants, manufacturers, farmers, professors, engineers, track walkers, college women, butchers, barbers, fishermen, actors, coal miners, washermen, cabmen, shopgirls, bootblacks. These are organized into occupational castes that differ from our trade unions chiefly in the loose expectation that sons will follow the trades of their fathers. The great tragedy of the caste system is that it has multiplied from generation to generation those untouchables whose growing number and rebelliousness undermine the institution that created them. The outcasts have received into their ranks all those who were enslaved by war or debt, all the children of marriages between Brahmins and Shudras, and all those unfortunates whose work as scavengers, butchers, acrobats, conjurers, or executioners was stamped as degrading by Brahmanical law, and they have swollen their mass by the improvident fertility of those who have nothing to lose. Their bitter poverty has made cleanliness of body, clothing, or food an impossible luxury for them, and their fellows shun them with every sense. Therefore the laws of caste forbid an untouchable to approach nearer than 24 feet to a Shudra, or 74 feet to a Brahmin. If the shadow of a pariah falls upon a man of caste, the latter must remove the contamination by a purifying ablution. Whatever the outcast touches is thereby defiled. In many parts of India, he must not draw water from the public wells or enter temples used by Brahmins or send his children to the Hindu schools. The British, whose policies have in some degree contributed to the impoverishment of the outcasts, have brought them at least equality before the law and equal access to all British-controlled colleges and schools. The nationalist movement under the inspiration of Gandhi has done much to lessen the disabilities of the untouchables. Perhaps another generation will see them externally and superficially free. The coming of industry and of Western ideas is disturbing the ancient mastery of the Hindu male. Industrialization defers the age of marriage, requires the emancipation of woman. That is to say, the woman cannot be lured into the factory unless she is persuaded that home is a prison, and is entitled by law to keep her earnings for herself. Many real reforms have come as incidents to this emancipation. Child marriage has been formally ended, in 1929, by raising the legal age of marriage to 14 for girls and to 18 for men. Sati has disappeared, and the remarriage of widows grows daily. Polygamy is allowed, but few men practice it, and tourists are disappointed to find that the temple dancers are almost extinct. In no other country is moral reform progressing so rapidly. Industrial city life is drawing women out of purdah. Hardly 6% of the women of India accept such seclusion today. A number of lively periodicals for women discuss the most up-to-date questions. Even a birth control league has appeared and has faced bravely the gravest problem of India, indiscriminate fertility. In many of the provinces, women vote and hold political office. Twice women have been president of the Indian National Congress. Many of them have taken degrees at the universities and have become doctors, lawyers, or professors. Soon, no doubt, the tables will be turned and women will rule. Must not some wild Western influence bear the guilt of this flaming appeal issued by a subaltern of Gandhi to the women of India? Away with ancient purdah. Come out of the kitchens quick. Fling the pots and pans rattling into the corners. Tear the cloth from your eyes and see the new world. Let your husbands and brothers cook for themselves. There is much work to be done to make India a nation. 5. The nationalist movement. The westernized students, the secularization of heaven, the Indian National Congress. In 1923, there were over 1,000 Hindus studying in England, presumably an equal number in America, perhaps an equal number elsewhere. They marveled at the privileges enjoyed by the lowliest citizens of Western Europe and America. They studied the French and American revolutions and read the literature of reform and revolt. They gloated over the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, the Declaration of Independence, and the American Constitution. They went back to their countries as centers of infection for democratic ideas and the gospel of liberty. The industrial and scientific advances of the West and the victory of the Allies in the war gave to these ideas an irresistible prestige. Soon every student was shouting the battle cry of freedom. In the schools of England and America, the Hindus learned to be free. These Western-educated Orientals had not only taken on political ideals in the course of their education abroad, they had shed religious ideas. The two processes are usually associated in biography and in history. They came to Europe as pious youths, wedded to Krishna, Shiva, Vishnu, Kali, Rama. They touched science, and their ancient faiths were shattered as by some sudden catalytic shock. Shorn of religious belief, which is the very spirit of India, the westernized Hindus returned to their country disillusioned and sad. 1,000 gods had dropped dead from the skies. Then inevitably utopia filled the place of heaven, democracy became a substitute for nirvana, liberty replaced God. What had gone on in Europe in the second half of the 18th century now went on in the East. Nevertheless, the new ideas developed slowly. In 1885, a few Hindu leaders met at Bombay and founded the Indian National Congress, but they do not seem to have dreamed even then of home rule. The effort of Lord Curzon to partition Bengal, that is, to destroy the unity and strength of the most powerful and politically conscious community in India, roused the nationalists to a more rebel mood, and at the Congress of 1905 the uncompromising Tilak demanded Swaraj. He had created the word out of Sanskrit roots still visible in its English translation, self-rule. In that same eventful year, Japan defeated Russia, and the East, which for a century had been fearful of the West, began to lay plans for the liberation of Asia. China followed Sun Yat-sen, took up the sword, and fell into the arms of Japan. India, weaponless, accepted as her leader one of the strangest figures in history, and gave to the world the unprecedented phenomenon of a revolution led by a saint and waged without a gun. 6. Mahatma Gandhi. Portrait of a Saint. The Ascetic, the Christian, the Education of Gandhi, in Africa, the Revolt of 1921, I Am the Man, Prison Years, Young India, the Revolution of the Spinning Wheel, the Achievements of Gandhi. Picture the ugliest, slightest, weakest man in Asia, with face and flesh of bronze, close-cropped gray head, high cheekbones, kindly little brown eyes, a large and almost toothless mouth, larger ears, an enormous nose, thin arms and legs, clad in a loincloth, standing before an English judge in India on trial for preaching non-cooperation to his countrymen. Or picture him seated on a small carpet in a bare room at his Satyagraha Ashram, school of truth-seekers, at Ahmedabad, his bony legs crossed under him in yogi fashion, soles upward, his hands busy at a spinning wheel, his face lined with responsibility, his mind active with ready answers to every questioner of freedom. From 1920 to 1935, this naked weaver was both the spiritual and the political leader of 320 million Indians. When he appeared in public, crowds gathered round him to touch his clothing or to kiss his feet. 4 hours a day he spun the coarse khadar, hoping by his example to persuade his countrymen to use this simple homespun instead of buying the product of those British looms that had ruined the textile industry of India. His only possessions were 3 rough cloths, 2 as his wardrobe and 1 as his bed. Once a rich lawyer, he had given all his property to the poor, and his wife, after some matronly hesitation, had followed his example. He slept on the bare floor or on the earth. He lived on nuts, plantains, lemons, oranges, dates, rice, and goat's milk. Often, for months together, he took nothing but milk and fruit. Once in his life he tasted meat. Occasionally he ate nothing for weeks. I can as well do without my eyes as without fasts. What the eyes are for the outer world, fasts are for the inner. As the blood thins, he felt, the mind clears. Irrelevancies fall away, and fundamental things, sometimes the very soul of the world, rise out of Maya like Everest through the clouds. At the same time that he fasted to see divinity, he kept 1 toe on the earth, and advised his followers to take an enema daily when they fasted, lest they be poisoned with the acid products of the body's self-consumption, just as they might be finding God. When the Moslems and the Hindus killed one another in theological enthusiasm and paid no heed to his pleas for peace, he went without food for 3 weeks to move them. He became so weak and frail through fasts and privations that when he addressed the great audiences that gathered to hear him, he spoke to them from an uplifted chair. He carried his asceticism into the field of sex and wished, like Tolstoy, to limit all physical intercourse to deliberate reproduction. He, too, in his youth had indulged the flesh too much, and the news of his father's death had surprised him in the arms of love. Now he returned with passionate remorse to the brahmacharya that had been preached to him in his boyhood, absolute abstention from all sensual desire. He persuaded his wife to live with him only as sister with brother, and from that time, he tells us, all dissension ceased. When he realized that India's basic need was birth control, he adopted not the methods of the West, but the theories of Malthus and Tolstoy. Is it right for us, who know the situation, to bring forth children? We only multiply slaves and weaklings if we continue the process of procreation whilst we feel and remain helpless. Not till India has become a free nation have we the right to bring forth progeny. I have not a shadow of doubt that married people, if they wish well to the country and want to see India become a nation of strong and handsome, well-formed men and women, would practice self-restraint and cease to procreate for the time being. Added to these elements in his character were qualities strangely like those that, we are told, distinguished the founder of Christianity. He did not mouth the name of Christ, but he acted as if he accepted every word of the Sermon on the Mount. Not since St. Francis of Assisi has any life known to history been so marked by gentleness, disinterestedness, simplicity, and forgiveness of enemies. It was to the credit of his opponents, but still more to his own, that his undiscourageable courtesy to them won a fine courtesy from them in return. The government sent him to jail with profuse apologies. He never showed rancor or resentment. Thrice he was attacked by mobs and beaten almost to death. Not once did he retaliate, and when one of his assailants was arrested, he refused to enter a charge. Shortly after the worst of all riots between Moslems and Hindus, when the Mopla Mohammedans butchered hundreds of unarmed Hindus and offered their prepuces as a covenant to Allah, these same Moslems were stricken with famine. Gandhi collected funds for them from all India and, with no regard for the best precedents, forwarded every anna without deduction for overhead to the starving enemy. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in 1869. His family belonged to the Vaishya caste and to the Jain sect, and practiced the ahimsa principle of never injuring a living thing. His father was a capable administrator, but an heretical financier. He lost place after place through honesty, gave nearly all his wealth to charity, and left the rest to his family. While still a boy, Mohandas became an atheist, being displeased with the adulterous gallantries of certain Hindu gods, and to make clear his everlasting scorn for religion, he ate meat. The meat disagreed with him, and he returned to religion. At 8 he was engaged, at 12 he was married to Kasturbai, who remained loyal to him through all his adventures, riches, poverty, imprisonments, and brahmacharya. At 18 he passed examinations for the university and went to London to study law. In his first year there, he read 80 books on Christianity. The Sermon on the Mount went straight to my heart in the first reading. He took the counsel to return good for evil and to love even one's enemies as the highest expression of all human idealism, and he resolved rather to fail with these than to succeed without them. Returning to India in 1891, he practiced law for a time in Bombay, refusing to prosecute for debt, and always reserving the right to abandon a case which he had come to think unjust. One case led him to South Africa. There he found his fellow Hindus so maltreated that he forgot to return to India, but gave himself completely, without remuneration, to the cause of removing the disabilities of his countrymen in Africa. For 20 years he fought this issue out until the government yielded. Only then did he return home. Traveling through India, he realized for the first time the complete destitution of his people. He was horrified by the skeletons whom he saw toiling in the fields and the lowly outcasts who did the menial work of the towns. It seemed to him that the discriminations against his countrymen abroad were merely one consequence of their poverty and subjection at home. Nevertheless, he supported England loyally in the war. He even advocated the enlistment of Hindus who did not accept the principle of nonviolence. He did not at that time agree with those who called for independence. He believed that British misgovernment in India was an exception, and that British government in general was good. That British government in India was bad just because it violated all the principles of British government at home, and that if the English people could be made to understand the case of the Hindus, it would soon accept them in full brotherhood into a commonwealth of free dominions. He trusted that when the war was over, and Britain counted India's sacrifice for the empire in men and wealth, it would no longer hesitate to give her liberty. But at the close of the war, the agitation for Home Rule was met by the Rowland Acts, which put an end to freedom of speech and press, by the establishment of the impotent legislature of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, and finally by the slaughter at Amritsar. Gandhi was shocked into decisive action. He returned to the Viceroy the decorations which he had received at various times from British governments, and he issued to India a call for active civil disobedience against the government of India. The people responded not with peaceful resistance, as he had asked, but with bloodshed and violence. In Bombay, for example, they killed 53 unsympathetic Parsis. Gandhi, vowed to ahimsa, sent out a second message, in which he called upon the people to postpone the campaign of civil disobedience, on the ground that it was degenerating into mob rule. Seldom in history had a man shown more courage in acting on principle, scorning expediency and popularity. The nation was astonished at his decision. It had supposed itself near to success, and it did not agree with Gandhi that the means might be as important as the end. The reputation of the Mahatma sank to the lowest ebb. It was just at this point, in March 1922, that the government determined upon his arrest. He made no resistance, declined to engage a lawyer, and offered no defense. When the prosecutor charged him with being responsible through his publications for the violence that had marked the outbreak of 1921, Gandhi replied in terms that lifted him at once to nobility. "I wish to endorse all the blame that the learned Advocate General has thrown on my shoulder in connection with the incidents in Bombay, Madras, and Chaurichara. Thinking over these deeply and sleeping over them night after night, it is impossible for me to dissociate myself from these diabolical crimes. The learned Advocate General is quite right when he says that as a man of responsibility, a man having received a fair share of education, I should have known the consequences of every one of my acts. I knew that I was playing with fire, I ran the risk, and if I was set free, I would still do the same. I felt this morning that I would have failed in my duty if I did not say what I say here just now. I wanted to avoid violence. I want to avoid violence. Non-violence is the first article of my faith. It is also the last article of my creed. But I had to make my choice. I had either to submit to a system which I considered had done an irreparable harm to my country, or incur the risk of the mad fury of my people bursting forth when they understood the truth from my lips. I know that my people have sometimes gone mad. I am deeply sorry for it, and I am therefore here to submit not to a light penalty, but to the highest penalty. I do not ask for mercy. I do not plead any extenuating act. I am here, therefore, to invite and cheerfully submit to the highest penalty that can be inflicted upon me for what in law is a deliberate crime and what appears to me to be the highest duty of a citizen." The judge expressed his profound regret that he had to send to jail one whom millions of his countrymen considered a great patriot and a great leader. He admitted that even those who differed from Gandhi looked upon him as a man of high ideals and of noble and even saintly life. He sentenced him to prison for 6 years. Gandhi was put under solitary confinement, but he did not complain. "I do not see any of the other prisoners," he wrote, "though I really do not see how my society can do them any harm. But I feel happy. My nature likes loneliness. I love quietness, and now I have opportunity to engage in studies that I had to neglect in the outside world." He instructed himself sedulously in the writings of Bacon, Carlyle, Ruskin, Emerson, Thoreau, and Tolstoy, and solaced long hours with Ben Jonson and Walter Scott. He read and reread the Bhagavad Gita. He studied Sanskrit, Tamil, and Urdu so that he might be able not only to write for scholars, but to speak to the multitude. He drew up a detailed schedule of studies for the 6 years of his imprisonment, and pursued it faithfully till accident intervened. "I used to sit down to my books with the delight of a young man of 24, and forgetting my 54 years and my poor health." Appendicitis secured his release, and Occidental medicine, which he had often denounced, secured his recovery. A vast crowd gathered at the prison gates to greet him on his exit, and many kissed his coarse garment as he passed. But he shunned politics and the public eye, pled his weakness and illness, and retired to his school at Ahmedabad, where he lived for many years in quiet isolation with his students. From that retreat, however, he sent forth weekly, through his mouthpiece Young India, editorials expounding his philosophy of revolution and life. He begged his followers to shun violence, not only because it would be suicidal, since India had no guns, but because it would only replace one despotism with another. History, he told them, teaches one that those who have, no doubt with honest motives, ousted the greedy by using brute force against them, have in their turn become a prey to the disease of the conquered. My interest in India's freedom will cease if she adopts violent means, for their fruit will not be freedom, but slavery. The second element in his creed was the resolute rejection of modern industry, and a Rousseauian call for a return to the simple life of agriculture and domestic industry in the village. The confinement of men and women in factories, making with machines owned by others fractions of articles whose finished form they will never see, seemed to Gandhi a roundabout way of burying humanity under a pyramid of shoddy goods. Most machine products, he thought, are unnecessary. The labor saved in using them is consumed in making and repairing them, or if labor is really saved, it is of no benefit to labor, but only to capital. Labor is thrown by its own productivity into a panic of technological unemployment. So he renewed the Swadeshi movement, announced in 1905 by Tilak. Self-production was to be added to Swaraj, self-rule. Gandhi made use of the charka, or spinning wheel, a test of loyal adherence to the nationalist movement. He asked that every Hindu, even the richest, should wear homespun, and boycott the alien and mechanical textiles of Britain, so that the homes of India might hum once more through the dull winter with the sound of the spinning wheel. The response was not universal. It is difficult to stop history in its course, but India tried. Hindu students everywhere dressed in khadar. High-born ladies abandoned their Japanese silk saris for coarse cloths woven by themselves. Prostitutes in brothels and convicts in prison began to spin, and in many cities great feasts of the vanities were arranged, as in Savonarola's day, at which wealthy Hindus and merchants brought from their homes and warehouses all their imported cloth and flung it into the fire. In one day, at Bombay alone, 150,000 pieces were consumed by the flames. The movement away from industry failed, but it gave India for a decade a symbol of revolt and helped to polarize her mute millions into a new unity of political consciousness. India doubted the means, but honored the purpose, and though it questioned Gandhi the statesman, it took to its heart Gandhi the saint, and for a moment became one in reverencing him. It was as Tagore said of him. He stopped at the thresholds of the huts of the thousands of dispossessed, dressed like one of their own. He spoke to them in their own language. Here was living truth at last, and not only quotations from books. For this reason, the Mahatma, the name given to him by the people of India, is his real name. Who else has felt like him that all Indians are his own flesh and blood? When love came to the door of India, that door was opened wide. At Gandhi's call, India blossomed forth to new greatness, just as once before in earlier times when Buddha proclaimed the truth of fellow-feeling and compassion among all living creatures. It was Gandhi's task to unify India, and he accomplished it. Other tasks await other men. 7. Farewell to India. One cannot conclude the history of India as one can conclude the history of Egypt or Babylonia or Assyria, for that history is still being made, that civilization is still creating. Culturally, India has been reinvigorated by mental contact with the West, and her literature today is as fertile and noble as any. Spiritually, she is still struggling with superstition and excess theological baggage, but there is no telling how quickly the acids of modern science will dissolve these supernumerary gods. Politically, the last 100 years have brought to India such unity as she has seldom had before, partly the unity of one alien government, partly the unity of one alien speech, but above all the unity of one welding aspiration to liberty. Economically, India is passing, for better and for worse, out of medievalism into modern industry. Her wealth and her trade will grow, and before the end of the century she will doubtless be among the powers of the earth. We cannot claim for this civilization such direct gifts to our own as we have traced to Egypt and the Near East, for these last were the immediate ancestors of our own culture, while the history of India, China, and Japan flowed in another stream and is only now beginning to touch and influence the current of Occidental life. It is true that even across the Himalayan barrier, India has sent to us such questionable gifts as grammar and logic, philosophy and fables, hypnotism and chess, and above all our numerals and our decimal system. But these are not the essence of her spirit. They are trifles compared to what we may learn from her in the future. As invention, industry, and trade bind the continents together, or as they fling us into conflict with Asia, we shall study its civilizations more closely, and shall absorb, even in enmity, some of its ways and thoughts. Perhaps in return for conquest, arrogance, and spoliation, India will teach us the tolerance and gentleness of the mature mind, the quiet content of the unacquisitive soul, the calm of the understanding spirit, and a unifying, pacifying love for all living things. Book 3. The Far East. A. China. An emperor knows how to govern when poets are free to make verses, people to act plays, historians to tell the truth, ministers to give advice, the poor to grumble at taxes, students to learn lessons aloud, workmen to praise their skill and seek work, people to speak of anything, and old men to find fault with everything. Address of the Duke of Shao to King Li Wang, circa 845 B.C. Chapter 23. The Age of the Philosophers. 1. The Beginnings. 1. Estimates of the Chinese. The intellectual discovery of China was one of the achievements of the Enlightenment. These peoples, Diderot wrote of the Chinese, are superior to all other Asiatics in antiquity, art, intellect, wisdom, policy, and in their taste for philosophy. Nay, in the judgment of certain authors, they dispute the palm in these matters with the most enlightened peoples of Europe. The body of this empire, said Voltaire, has existed 4,000 years without having undergone any sensible alteration in its laws, customs, language, or even in its fashions of apparel. The organization of this empire is, in truth, the best that the world has ever seen. This respect of scholars has survived closer acquaintance, and in some contemporary observers it has reached the pitch of humble admiration. Count Kaiserling, in one of the most instructive and imaginative books of our time, concludes that
Altogether, the most perfect type of humanity as a normal phenomenon has been elaborated in ancient China. China has created the highest universal culture of being hitherto known. The greatness of China takes hold of and impresses me more and more. The great men of this country stand on a higher level of culture than ours do. These gentlemen stand on an extraordinarily high level as types. Especially their superiority impresses me. How perfect the courtesy of the cultured Chinaman. China's supremacy of form is unquestionable in all circumstances. The Chinaman is perhaps the profoundest of all men. The Chinese do not trouble to deny this, and until the present century, there are now occasional exceptions, they were unanimous in regarding the inhabitants of Europe and America as barbarians. It was the gentle custom of the Chinese in official documents before 1860 to employ the character for barbarian in rendering the term foreigner, and the barbarians had to stipulate by treaty that this translation should be improved. Like most other peoples of the earth, the Chinese consider themselves the most polished and civilized of all nations. Perhaps they are right. Despite their political corruption and chaos, their backward science and sweated industry, their odorous cities and awful-strewn fields, their floods and famines, their apathy and cruelty, their poverty and superstition, their reckless breeding and suicidal wars, their slaughters and ignominious defeats. For behind this dark surface that now appears to the alien eye is one of the oldest and richest of living civilizations, a tradition of poetry reaching as far back as 1700 B.C., a long record of philosophy, idealistic and yet practical, profound and yet intelligible, a mastery of ceramics and painting, unequaled in their kind, an easy perfection rivaled only by the Japanese in all the minor arts, the most effective morality to be found among the peoples of any time, a social organization that has held together more human beings and has endured through more centuries than any other known to history, a form of government which, until the Revolution destroyed it, was the almost ideal of philosophers, a society that was civilized when Greece was inhabited by barbarians, that saw the rise and fall of Babylonia and Assyria, Persia and Judea, Athens and Rome, Venice and Spain, and may yet survive when those Balkans called Europe have reverted to darkness and savagery. What is the secret of this durability of government, this artistry of hand, this poise and depth of soul? 2. The Middle Flowery Kingdom. Geography, Race, Prehistory. If we consider Russia as Asiatic, which it was till Peter and may be again, then Europe becomes only a jagged promontory of Asia, the industrial projection of an agricultural hinterland, the tentative fingers or pseudopodia of a giant continent. Dominating that continent is China, as spacious as Europe and as populous. Hemmed in through most of its history by the largest ocean, the highest mountains, and one of the most extensive deserts in the world, China enjoyed an isolation that gave her comparative security and permanence, immutability and stagnation. Hence the Chinese called their country not China, but Tianhua, under the heavens, or Shihai, within the four seas, or Chongguo, Middle Kingdom, or Chunhua Kuo, Middle Flowery Kingdom, or, by decree of the Revolution, Chunhua Min Kuo, Middle Flowery People's Kingdom. Flowers it has in abundance, and all the varied natural scenery that can come from sunshine and floating mists, perilous mountain crags, majestic rivers, deep gorges, and swift waterfalls amid rugged hills. Through the fertile south runs the Yangtze River, 3,000 miles in length. Farther north, the Huangho, or Yellow River, descends from the western ranges amid plains of less to carry its silt through vacillating estuaries, once to the Yellow Sea, now to the Gulf of Pechili, tomorrow possibly to the Yellow Sea again. Along these and the Wei and other broad streams, Chinese civilization began, driving back the beast and the jungle, holding the surrounding barbarians at bay, clearing the soil of brush and bramble, ridding it of destructive insects and corrosive deposits like saltpeter, draining the marshes, fighting droughts and floods and devastating changes in the courses of the rivers, drawing the water patiently and wearily from these friendly enemies into 1,000 canals, and building day by day through centuries, huts and houses, temples and schools, villages, cities, and states. How long men have toiled to build the civilizations that men so readily destroy. No one knows whence the Chinese came, or what was their race, or how old their civilization is. The remains of the Peking man suggest the great antiquity of the human ape in China, and the researches of Andrews have led him to conclude that Mongolia was thickly populated as far back as 20,000 B.C., by a race whose tools corresponded to the Azilian development of Mesolithic Europe, and whose descendants spread into Siberia and China as southern Mongolia dried up and became the Gobi Desert. The discoveries of Anderson and others in Honan and South Manchuria indicate a Neolithic culture 1,000 or 2,000 years later than similar stages in the prehistory of Egypt and Sumeria. Some of the stone tools found in these Neolithic deposits resemble exactly in shape and perforations the iron knives now used in northern China to reap the sorghum crop. And this circumstance, small though it is, reveals the probability that Chinese culture has an impressive continuity of 7,000 years. We must not, through the blur of distance, exaggerate the homogeneity of this culture or of the Chinese people. Some elements of their early art and industry appear to have come from Mesopotamia and Turkestan. For example, the Neolithic pottery of Honan is almost identical with that of Anau and Susa. The present Mongolian type is a highly complex mixture in which the primitive stock has been crossed and recrossed by 100 invading or immigrating stocks from Mongolia, southern Russia, the Scythians, and Central Asia. China, like India, is to be compared with Europe as a whole rather than with any one nation of Europe. It is not the united home of one people, but a medley of human varieties, different in origin, distinct in language, diverse in character and art, and often hostile to one another in customs, morals, and government. 3. The unknown centuries. The creation, according to China, the coming of culture, wine and chopsticks, the virtuous emperors, a royal atheist. China has been called the paradise of historians. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.